Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. If one tries to look at the Mediterranean from west to east, the obvious checkpoint of Gibraltar is nowadays the most serene one, and there is no trouble between Spain in the north and the African nation of Morocco, except for migrants trying to cross over into Europe. Storm clouds start to gather over the central region, where Libya is torn between local forces which are respectively helped by two eastern Mediterranean powers, Egypt and Turkey. Going east, turbulence picks up. There is a dispute about dividing the spoils of the sea between Lebanon and Israel, and even more so between the bitter enemies, Turkey and Greece, which are in conflict over the resources hidden below the Aegean Sea. With exploratory talks between Athens and Ankara about to set sail, we will try to break it all down with our distinguished panelists. Joining us from Central Israel is Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the co-host of TV7's Middle East Review, the vice president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and a lecturer at Shalem College in Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, as usual.
Indeed, and also joining us from another location in Central Israel is Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, who is a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, as well as at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
And here in the studio with us is our TV7 analyst and host of TV7's Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding of the focus of today's program.
So as you said, Jonathan, if we start our journey in the central region of the Mediterranean, there are signs of hope in Libya. With talks sponsored by outside forces, the United Nations, other powers. It seems as if the major combatants are ready to compromise in a very complicated scheme in which a new government will be chosen. We know from past experience that such optimistic outlooks tend to fall apart later on. But right now, for the first time in a decade or so since Muammar Gaddafi was toppled, it seems as if the nation of Libya, which has been cobbled from several tribes and districts there, is on the road to success. Then we go into the Aegean and the conflict between Turkey and Greece, on which we will focus much of this conversation. But just to touch on the westernmost part, Lebanon and Israel. It has been 14 years, almost 14 and a half, before Israel and since Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah and Lebanon clashed. Deterrence has been kept. But right now, because of domestic problems in Lebanon, the economy collapsing, the Lebanese pound, subsidies almost out, corruption leading to the explosion in Beirut last August, with the judge investigating it being ousted by the very politicians he was supposed to investigate. All of that could cause an implosion in Lebanon and an explosion between Lebanon and Israel because many elements within Lebanon would have an interest in trying to export their problems.
Indeed, talking specifically about the most eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, but I'd like to refer the next point to Dr. Lerman. What is the current situation in which Israel is most impacted by in the whole ordeal, considering the fact that we are hearing that discussions have now emerged between Turkey and Egypt, with preliminary talks taking place behind the scenes. And, of course, there have been various naval maneuvers when we're talking about the Dina maneuver between Israel, Cyprus, France, and Greece, even though the most interesting thing about this specifically was the fact that the United States was not part of this maneuver, which usually was under its auspices. And then there was, of course, the Blue Homeland maneuver by Turkey, which signified, of course, significant firepower being utilized by the Turkish military and navy in particular, signaling that it has the capacity to defend its interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. How do you see that?
Well, of course, it is in Israel's profound interest for this never to come to actual blows. A war between Turkey and Greece is catastrophic. Would we have having catastrophic consequences for the Eastern Mediterranean? These are power plays. These are displays of intent. But at the end of the day, I think it is, from an Israeli perspective, a very good thing that Turkey and Greece should sit down from a position not of Turkish dictation under threat, but in a diplomatic manner to resolve the question of delineation of the borders in the Eastern Mediterranean in an equitable way. The same is also true for the Turkish-Egyptian relationship. What is important for Israel in such a negotiation would be to ensure that the delineation does not cut off Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus from, for example, the European markets, because there's a question mark as to whether it is possible to lay a pipeline or a power line from, for example, Cyprus or the common area of gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean, if it has to go through a Turkish and Libyan territory under political control from Ankara. So we want to be in a situation where the Turks have some redress for their grievances, but the map that will emerge in between the Turkish-Libyan map and the Greek-Egyptian map will be one that does not block Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus from having access to Europe. This is a strategic interest. It can be resolved. It is not beyond human ingenuity to produce such an outcome. This is what is important to us. Beyond that, what is also important to us is to maintain the alignment of forces that runs from the UAE all the way to Paris, includes Israel, Egypt, Greece. Cyprus is not a power, but it is part of the alignment. And also to maintain stability in Egypt, which is very, very important for Israel. And if Turkey can reduce its level of meddling in Egyptian affairs and in Libyan affairs, it would be a benefit.
Indeed. Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, your perspective on this, especially after the first round of exploratory talks between Ankara and Athens already took place some time ago. Nevertheless, ever since that occurred, we had repeated exchanges of rhetoric, exchanges of accusations about various disagreements. And we see, of course, also the Turkish side more held back to a certain degree, considering the fact that later this month, or actually next week, we will have the leaders of EU member states reconvene once again to discuss the Turkish question, the Aegean Sea and Eastern Mediterranean in particular, with EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell expected to prepare a document monitoring Turkish activities and also providing recommendations for potential punitive measures if EU member states are able to reach a consensus on doing so.
Well, from the Turkish point of view, this issue of the Eastern Mediterranean is also, it's not only related with natural gas, but it is very much related with national sovereignty. And as far as we know, the Turks historically regarded the Mediterranean Sea as a Turkish lake. When you're looking at the Turkish school textbooks, you're going to see this perspective that it is passing from generation to generation to the Turkish citizens. And as a result, given the fact that the Turkish foreign policy became Mr. Erdogan's public relations instrument, he cannot basically give up easily from Turkey's rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. And as a result, Turkey until today adopted a brinkmanship policy vis-a-vis Greece. And this brinkmanship policy basically provided a very important support for Mr. Erdogan at home in terms of constituency. But besides that, I also would like to mention here other dimensions of this picture. Recently, the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu announced that Turkey is willing to launch a normalization with Egypt, and this normalization act, he said that should be also supported with a new maritime delimitation agreement with the Egyptians. And when we are looking at that particular map, we're gonna see that, of course, the Turkish-Egyptian zones are designed at the expense of the Republic of Cyprus and Greece. Of course, from the Egyptian perspective, this would mean to sacrifice their relationship with the Greeks. And as a result, until now, we did not hear and see any concrete positive Egyptian response to the Turkish offer. But something very important there, as you may remember, last December, the Rear Admiral Cihat Yaycı published an article at the Turkey Scope journal at the Moshe Dayan Center, and he proposed a map there. And in that particular map, we began to see a new understanding that Turkey sees Israel as its maritime neighbor. And that particular border can also be seen in the proposed Turkish map that was submitted to the Egyptians, meaning that Turkey is trying to persuade the Egyptians with the same map. They are trying to convince them in order to put an end to this alliance between Israel, Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus. And very ironically, I would like to underline this fact, that the most important, the architect of this alliance was Mr. Erdogan himself and his foreign policy doctrine called the precious loneliness. Nowadays, Turks are doing everything to put an end to their loneliness, but until now, the decision makers in Jerusalem and in Cairo, as far as I understand, they are not ready to sacrifice their relations with Athens and Nicosia.
Quite evidently so, Mr. Oren. When we're talking about those Turkish attempts, it seems like they are futile attempts, considering the fact that also just recently there was an agreement during an East Med forum in which Israel, of course, signed an agreement with Egypt, with Cyprus and Greece, or several agreements also in order to create an underwater line of electricity connecting the Israeli electrical grid to Europe for times of emergency. Tell us a little bit about that, and to what degree can any agreement actually with Turkey emerge if it does not recognize Cyprus as a contender for any possible or viable sovereign position?
Well, along with the Israeli dependence on the United States and excellent strategic relationship with Washington, the fact that Egypt is at peace with Israel is Israel's most important asset. And it is not going to sacrifice that for some passing benefit from Turkey, especially not under Erdogan. He's mercurial. He may be one day positive, the next day negative. It's a bipolar foreign policy. But more than that, Egypt cannot sacrifice Greece because of the powerful Greek lobby on Capitol Hill, which Egypt dare not contend with because of the delicate relationship between the Biden administration and the Sisi government, especially on human rights, especially because there are dual nationals, American, Egyptian, still harassed by the Egyptian security forces. From the Egyptian perspective, they are acting against terrorism and sedition, but it doesn't matter. There is a powerful group of American congressmen from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that the Egyptians should not get into a fight with. So whatever Erdogan is trying to do to put a wedge between Egypt and Greece is bound to fail. But let me just mention something which is seemingly not political, but still a geopolitical fact. Israel is now contending with the COVID-19 crisis. And what happened? It decided to close Ben Gurion Airport, and many thousands of Israelis have been stuck outside, abroad, many of them in Greece and in the Greek islands. They cannot come back home. When Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier this month wanted to fly to Dubai, he had to ask permission from the Jordanians and then to cross over Saudi Arabia. This is all problematic. So Israel, as a Mediterranean country, should always be careful that its relationship with its neighbors, some to the east, such as Jordan, but mostly to the west, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, this should be paramount in the considerations of policymakers in Jerusalem.
Indeed, of course, it illustrates the unique situation of Israel, but the skies have been opened since then.
But you know, Chai mentioned the precious loneliness, or as the British used to call it, splendid isolation. Usually this is what empires say when they really believe that they're isolating the rest of the world. But after a while, they tend to regret it.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, I'd like to understand your perspective. The East Med Forum, of course, took place. There were various agreements signed, MOUs were brought forth, and plenty of there was, of course, focused on bolstering relations or multilateral relations between Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, and the EU member state Greece. France was there as an observatory as well, if I'm not mistaken. How do you...
France has now been accepted as a full member.
Okay, so
together with Italy of the EMGF. So it's by now not East, it's a Mediterranean forum, really, because France is, of course, in the Western Mediterranean.
Correct. So to what degree do you see this actually bolstering this camp or alignment, as you stated earlier, with regard to the grievances which Turkey has, considering the fact that it is mitigated from expanding in territorial waters, which obviously the East Mediterranean or the Mediterranean at large is very dense when we're talking about various state actors?
Well, the Turkish push for broader rights in a larger chunk of the Eastern Mediterranean economic waters, EEZ, was already being resisted by the French before they actually joined the EMGF. They took a very firm position in support of Greece last year and more recently. And they have been selling advanced fighter aircraft to Greece. They have offered the Cypriots some support, maybe a French military presence in the region. We are talking about a very serious French commitment to prevent Turkey from dominating and from overrunning the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The fact that France is now a full member, France is very close to the UAE. The UAE is also aligned against Turkey on Egypt and on other issues. This could lead either to a confrontation or to a reconsideration in Ankara of their priorities. The fact that the Biden administration was giving Erdogan the cold shoulder. Erdogan was waiting for the famous first phone call, which didn't come. I think it is one more reason for Ankara to reconsider. There's a lot for them to gain in not only trying to reach out individually to Israel, Egypt, and France and try to pry them away from each other, but actually to look overall for a strategy of cooperation rather than confrontation within the framework of a Mediterranean commonality of interest. There is a room for Turkey. In every statement made by the tripartite meetings of Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus, or the EMGF as a forum, there was also always a mention of the fact that this is not an exclusive club. We are willing and able to take on other like-minded nations. That was a way of saying to Erdogan, if Turkey changes course, changes trajectory, it will have a legitimate and honorable place in this scheme of things. If it tries to pry each member of the EMGF out individually, I think this will fail, and their position in Washington will only will deteriorate further. But this can change if they change their attitude.
Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, I'd like to ask specifically about the agreement that was signed at the time between the Tripoli-based government in Libya and Turkey, Ankara, which provided an exclusive economic zone, basically territory between the two countries, disregarding Cyprus, disregarding Greece, and blocking Israel and Egypt very much into a very small corridor on the eastern line of the Mediterranean Sea. To what degree now that that a new government, or at least a caretaker government at this stage, was voted upon in Libya, and things are set in motion, starting to change there somewhat, even though on the ground not much has changed. Is there now here some concern of Turkey that it needs to look at new dimensions to this situation, or is there now more of a concern because of the various factors that were mentioned during the show?
Well, the Turkish intervention to Libya was carried out, of course, as a result of this maritime delimitation agreement between the government of national accord and Turkey. And the most important purpose of this agreement was to break the geographical contiguity between Greece and Republic of Cyprus. When you're looking at the map, you're going to see that the Turkish-Libyan corridor is at the expense of the Greek exclusive economic zones, especially next to Rhodos and also the Crete, the island of Crete. And from my perspective, given the fact that the Turkish army's intervention and the Turkish army's intervention in Libya changed the whole picture in the Libyan civil war. The Turks invested there in a very, generously. They sent their Bayraktar UAVs. They sent their armored vehicles called Kirpi. They launched their various ghost ships that they took their many arms. And therefore, from my perspective, the Turks will not give up, will remain on the Libyan soil, and the current Libyan government, as far as I understand, they are also aware of the fact that the Turks are not going to give up their interests, since they invested in Libya very much. In this regard, I also would like to mention that the Turkish contractor firms, the construction companies, are very much eager to penetrate into the Libyan market. And let me also underline the fact that these construction companies are regarded as the most important supporter of Mr. Erdogan's infrastructure projects inside Turkey. So this is very much connected also to the Turkish economy, also to Turkey's immediate interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, and also to the Turkish penetration inside, Libya.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
Let me add something which we haven't focused on yet, and that is what has been happening either intentionally or not intentionally on the maritime front. There were two probably separate incidents. One is what was reported on by the Wall Street Journal, a series of attacks on petroleum-bearing ships coming from Iran to Syria, attacks by Israel. And the other, which was depicted by some commentators erroneously as a reaction, was the ecological disaster, the pollution out because of a leakage from one of those ships carrying oil from Iran through the Suez Canal to Syria. And that means that the Mediterranean, we have talked about cooperation, energy, economy, but it could very well flare up, and we could see an escalation both between Turkey and Greece, but also between Israel, Iran, and its proxies.
And we didn't speak, of course, about Russia and the fact that it does have the control of the exclusive economic zone of Syria, which is also a contender in the Eastern Mediterranean,
Yes.
even though not significantly so, but there is Hamimim base and the various bases there. Is this also a big factor?
Well, it is a factor. It is a permanent fact. And by the way, we haven't heard about Malta. We haven't heard about Sicily and their geographic boundaries. Perhaps if they look south towards the Gulf of Sidra, perhaps they will have some trouble waiting for the Libyans. Who knows?
Well, who knows indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank Dr. Ran Lerman, Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, and Mr. Amir Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.